I'm freezing, let me in, I beg. I'll reward you. The beautiful Creole woman said from his doorstep. That's what she said, or something close to it, her words all tangled up in the chattering of her teeth. The man, Silas. He didn't hear the words so much as he felt them. He felt them in the way the wind cut through the chinks in his cabin walls, the same wind that was trying to tear the thin silk of her dress right off her bones. It was a dress for a city, for a warm night in a place with gaslights and music, not for the high lonesome of his mountain where the sleet came down like tiny sharp knives in late autumn. He just stood there in the doorway, the warm, smoky air from his fire clinging to him like a second skin, and he looked at her. He saw the goose flesh on her arms, the way her dark skin was turning a strange shade of purple-blue at the lips and fingertips. He saw the desperation in her eyes, big dark eyes that had seen too much, and he saw the way she was trying to hold herself together. One arm wrapped around her waist like that could somehow keep her from shattering into a million frozen pieces. The dust of the long road was caked on her legs, mixed with mud and something that looked dark, maybe blood. Her hair, a cascade of black curls that would have been beautiful, was plastered to her scalp with rain and sweat. He could smell the fear on her, a sharp animal scent beneath the smell of wet earth, and the cold, clean smell of the coming snow. She wasn't just cold. She was hunted. He could see it in the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, back into the endless, swallowing darkness of the woods she'd just come out of. There was nothing out there but the sound of the wind in the pines and the skittering of unseen things. But to her, that darkness was full of monsters. He knew that look. He'd seen it on deer just before the wolves closed in. The silence between them stretched out, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of his fire inside. He hadn't had a visitor in 5 years, not since he buried his wife and boy out back. He didn't want one. The silence was his companion, his penance, his peace. And here she was, a whirlwind of color and cold and terror, threatening to tear it all down. "I'll reward you," she repeated, her voice a raw whisper, and it was a promise that sounded more like a curse. It sounded like the only currency she had left to trade, something she'd been forced to learn the value of. He saw the flicker of shame in her eyes as she said it, the way she braced herself for his answer, for the look of a man calculating her worth. But Silas wasn't calculating. He was just a man who knew what it was to be cold, to be at the end of your rope. He saw the raw, scraped flesh on her feet where her flimsy shoes had given out. He saw the tremor in her hands that wasn't just from the cold. He saw a soul pushed to the very edge of the cliff, and his own soul, buried deep under years of grief and solitude, gave a small, painful lurch. It was a damn inconvenience. It was trouble walking right up to his door and begging to be let in. His whole life was built around avoiding trouble. But there was a point where a man, even a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, couldn't just stand there and watch another human being freeze to death on his doorstep. It wasn't about the reward. It was about the simple, brutal fact of the cold, and the simple, brutal fact of the warmth behind him. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. This is a good spot to pause for a second. If you're out there watching, I'd love to know where from. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're in. And if this story's got its hooks in you so far, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It means the world and helps us keep telling these stories. Now, let's get back to it. Silas didn't say a word. Words were clumsy things, mostly useless. He just stepped back from the door, a slow, deliberate movement, and pulled it open wider. It was an invitation, but it wasn't a welcome. It was a statement of fact. Outside was death. Inside was life. Choose. For a second, she just stared at him, maybe expecting a negotiation, a leering smile, a price to be named. She found none of it. His face was a mask carved from old wood, his eyes holding no warmth but no malice either. They were just steady, like the mountain he lived on. He was a big man, not with fat but with the hard, dense muscle of someone who splits his own wood and hauls his own water. His hands were calloused and scarred, his beard was untrimmed, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky. He looked like a part of the wilderness, something that had grown out of the rock and soil. She hesitated, a flicker of fear crossing her features. Maybe the devil you know is better than the one you don't. The man in the woods might be worse than the men in the dark. He saw her hesitation and gave a gruff, impatient jerk of his head toward the fire. That was all the encouragement he had to offer. She took a shuffling step forward, then another, crossing the threshold from the howling wind into the shocking, thick warmth of the cabin. The door shut behind her with a solid, heavy thud that seemed to cut the world in two. Outside, the storm. Inside, the fire and the silence of this strange, hard man. She stumbled toward the stone hearth, her body shaking so violently now that the warmth was hitting it. She collapsed onto the rough-hewn wooden floor, as close to the flames as she could get without setting her wet dress alight. She didn't look at him. She just stared into the fire, her hands outstretched, as if the flames were a god she was praying to. Silas watched her for a long moment. He didn't feel pity. Pity was a soft, useless emotion. He felt a grim sort of recognition. He knew what it was to be broken down to nothing but the raw need for survival. He went over to the iron stove, took the lid off a pot, and the smell of venison stew filled the small cabin. He ladled a thick, lumpy portion into a wooden bowl. He didn't ask if she was hungry. It was a stupid question. He walked over and set the bowl down on the floor beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just put the food there and walked away, back to his side of the room, and sat down in his worn-out chair, picking up a piece of leather he'd been mending. An unspoken truce was established. I will not harm you. I will give you food and fire, ask for nothing more. The first night was a long, silent ritual. She ate the stew like a starving wolf, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold the spoon he'd left in the bowl. When she was done, she set the empty bowl down and just continued to stare into the fire, the warmth slowly, painfully seeping back into her limbs. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty. It was thick with everything that wasn't being said. It was full of the ghosts of her past and the ghosts of his. Silas saw the ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, a dark purple against her beautiful skin. He saw the long, angry red welts on her arms, shaped like a rope or a strap. He got up, went to a small cupboard, and came back with a clean rag and a small basin of water. He set it down next to her, just like he had with the stew. He didn't offer to help. The gesture was plain. Here, clean your wounds. She looked from the basin to his face, and for the first time there was something other than fear in her eyes. It was confusion. This wasn't the transaction she was used to. There were no strings attached to this kindness, no price demanded. It was just there. She dipped the rag in the cool water and began to clean the dirt and dried blood from a cut on her leg. Her movements were slow, methodical. Each dab of the rag was a reclamation, a small act of taking back her own body from the abuse it had suffered. Silas went back to his chair, his hands busy with the leather, but his eyes were watching the firelight play over her face. He was mending a strap for a saddle, his stitches strong and even. The work was familiar, grounding. He could hear her soft breathing, the hiss of the wet rag on her skin, the crackle of the logs in the hearth. These were the only sounds, a quiet symphony of survival. He had a cot in the corner, his own bed. He didn't offer it to her. He just took one of the heavy wool blankets off it and tossed it onto the floor near her. It landed with a soft thud. "Floor's warmer," he grunted. It was the first thing he'd said to her since telling her to get by the fire. She looked at the blanket, a thick, rough thing that smelled of wood smoke and pine. She pulled it around her shoulders, the coarse wool a comfort against her cold skin. She curled up on the floor, her back to him, facing the fire, and for the first time in what must have been days, she closed her eyes in a place that felt, if not safe, then at least sealed off from the immediate terrors of the world. He stayed in his chair for a long time, watching her silhouette rise and fall with each breath, until he was sure she was asleep. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin was a tiny island of warmth and light in a vast, dark, and freezing ocean. They didn't talk for 2 days. The storm blew itself out, leaving the world covered in a thick blanket of white. The silence was absolute. On the 3rd day, she started to speak. It wasn't a decision. The words just started spilling out of her, quiet and stumbling at first, then flowing like a river that had broken its dam. She was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in her thin dress with a needle and thread Silas had left on the table. He was sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the air. "My mother, she grew the most beautiful flowers," she said, her voice soft. "In New Orleans, we had a little courtyard behind the house, filled with jasmine and hibiscus. The air, it always smelled sweet there. Silas didn't stop his work. He didn't look at her. He just kept scraping the stone against the blade, his rhythm unwavering. But he was listening. He came to the city, a man from up north, dressed in fine clothes. He said he saw a singer in me, said he could take me to Chicago, New York, said I'd be a star. She gave a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. I was a fool. I believed him. My mother, she warned me. She said his eyes were empty, but I wanted to see the world. I wanted more than the courtyard. She paused, her hands stilling. We never got to Chicago. We got as far as the river, and then the fine clothes disappeared. The kind words stopped. He said I owed him, said my passage, my food, it wasn't free. He had a ledger. Every meal, every night in a boarding house, he wrote it down. The debt just grew and grew. He said I had to work it off. She fell silent, the memory too sharp. The only sound was the scrape, scrape, scrape of the whetstone. He sold me, she finally whispered, the words raw and naked. To a man named Jebediah, a fur trapper. Said a man gets lonely in the woods, said I was good company. He didn't see a singer. He saw a thing, a piece of property to be used and passed on. She looked down at the welts on her arm, which were now fading to a sickly yellow-green. Jebediah and his friend. They were not kind men. I waited. I waited for my chance. 2 nights ago, they drank too much whiskey. They passed out. I just ran. I took nothing. I just ran into the woods. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for something. Not pity, just understanding. Silas stopped sharpening the axe. He set the stone down, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. He looked out the small, grimy window of the cabin. His gaze fell on a small, fenced-off patch of ground a little ways from the cabin. There were 2 mounds there marked by simple wooden crosses. He didn't have to tell her his story. It was right there. It was in the silence of the cabin, in the empty cot, in the way he moved through the world alone. He had his own ghosts. He just turned his head and looked at her. Jebediah, he said, the name a hard, flat stone in his mouth. He a big man, red beard? She nodded, her eyes widening. He trades at the settlement sometimes, Silas said, his voice low and empty of emotion. He's a bad man. That was it. That was all the confirmation she needed that her monsters were real, and that he knew them. It was enough. The first real threat didn't come from the woods. It came knocking. A week had passed. A fragile routine had formed. He would chop wood, check his traps. She would keep the fire going, cook the simple meals. Her presence a quiet, warm spot in the center of his cold, orderly world. Then, the knock. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a heavy, demanding fist against the thick wood of the door. Thump, thump, thump. Silas froze, his hand halfway to his mouth with a piece of jerky. He looked at her. All the color drained from her face. It was the same look of pure animal terror he'd seen the night she arrived. She knew who it was. He put a finger to his lips. Absolute silence. He moved without a sound, his big frame gliding across the floorboards. He took the heavy shotgun down from the pegs above the door. The metallic click as he checked the shells was deafening in the quiet room. Another knock, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. A voice bellowed from outside, rough and thick with whiskey. Silas, we know you're in there, you old hermit. We seen the smoke from your chimney. It was a voice she recognized. A guttural sob escaped her lips. A second voice, slimier, laughed. Jebediah wants his property back, Silas. Says a pretty little songbird flew her cage. We're just here to collect her for him. Her eyes were wide, locked on his. She was a cornered animal, ready to bolt, but there was nowhere left to run. Silas didn't panic. His face was grim, set. He pointed with the barrel of the shotgun towards the small root cellar door in the floor. Hide. His eyes were clear. There was no question. She scrambled over, her hands fumbling with the iron ring, and pulled the heavy door open. She slipped down into the cold, dark, earthy-smelling space without a backward glance. He kicked the rug over the door, hiding the ring from view. Just as he turned back to the main door, it shuddered under the impact of a heavy boot. Don't make us kick it in, old man. It'll be worse for you. Silas took a deep breath. He thumbed the hammer back on the shotgun. a deep, resonant click. He walked to the door and pulled the heavy bar that locked it. Then he opened it just a crack. A blast of cold air rushed in. Two men stood there. One was big and beefy, with a stupid grin on his face. The other was wiry and mean-looking, with shifty eyes. "What do you want?" Silas's voice was a low growl like stones grinding together. "Just looking for a runaway," the wiry one said, trying to peer past him into the cabin. "Creole girl, answers to—" Silas cut him off. He opened the door just enough for them to see the twin barrels of the shotgun pointed right at the wiry man's chest. "Ain't no one here but me," Silas said, his voice flat and deadly. "And I don't take kindly to visitors." The men's grins faded. They saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, emptier. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and wouldn't hesitate to kill them where they stood. The big man shuffled his feet. "Now hold on. Jebediah's offering a reward." "I ain't interested," Silas said. "Get off my land, now." The silence stretched. The two men looked at each other, then back at the twin barrels of the gun, and then at the unyielding face of the man holding it. They weren't brave men, just bullies. They backed away slowly. "You're making a mistake, old man," the wiry one spat. Silas just watched them, the shotgun steady in his hands, until they disappeared back into the trees. Only then did he shut the door, slide the heavy bar back into place, and lean against it, the adrenaline leaving him feeling hollow. The men were gone, but the peace was shattered. The cabin, which had started to feel like a shelter, now felt like a cage, a fortress under siege. The unspoken bond between them, forged in silence and shared warmth, now deepened into something else. A partnership. It wasn't spoken. It was built, action by action. Silas spent the next day reinforcing the cabin. He hammered new boards over the windows, leaving only small slits to see out of. He checked the hinges on the door, greased the lock. He was a man preparing for war. She didn't cower in a corner. She became his shadow, his second pair of hands. She held the board steady while he hammered. She tore strips of cloth for him to use as wadding for his rifle. She learned to load the old pistol he kept in a drawer, her hands small but steady around the cold metal. They moved around each other with a new, grim efficiency. A silent, perfectly choreographed dance of survival. One afternoon he took her out hunting, not for sport, but for food. The encounter with the two men had made him realize they couldn't risk going to the settlement for a long time. He handed her a small rifle, lighter than his own. "Know how to use one?" he grunted. She shook her head. He spent an hour showing her how to load it, how to aim, how to control her breathing. His instructions were curt, physical. He would move her arm into the right position, tap her shoulder to correct her stance. His touch was impersonal, practical, yet it was the most contact they'd ever had. They were tracking a buck through the snow-laden woods. The silence was absolute, the world muffled by the fresh powder. Silas moved like a ghost, his eyes scanning every shadow, every broken twig. She followed, trying to mimic his step, to be as silent. She was so focused on placing her feet that she didn't see the shadow moving in the trees above them. A mountain lion, sleek and powerful, crouched on a thick branch, its tail twitching. It wasn't watching them. It was watching the same buck, but they had stumbled into its hunting ground. She saw it first, a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. She didn't scream. She didn't have time. She just raised the rifle the way he'd taught her, and let out a sharp hiss. Silas froze. He followed her gaze and saw the cat just as it was tensing to spring. He didn't have a clear shot. In that split second, she fired. The shot was wild, nowhere near the cat, but the crack of the rifle echoed through the forest like a thunderclap. The cougar, startled by the sudden noise, leaped from the branch and disappeared into the dense undergrowth. The buck, long gone, was forgotten. Silas slowly lowered his own rifle. He looked at her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright, fierce. She hadn't hit the animal, but she had saved him. He had been so focused on the prey ahead that he had forgotten the predators above. He walked over to her, took the rifle from her trembling hands, and simply nodded. A single, curt nod. It was more than a thank you. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect. "You see, you are a survivor. You belong here." In that moment, the bond between them was no longer just about shelter. It was forged in shared danger, in the quiet, deadly language of the wild. He was the stone, immovable and strong. She was the fire, quick and sharp and full of a life he had forgotten he craved. Weeks bled into one another. The snow piled deeper. Their supplies started to run low. Salt, flour, coffee, things they couldn't hunt or forage for. The trip to the settlement was unavoidable. It was a risk, but a necessary one. They went together. Silas drove his old mule and cart, the animal's breath pluming in the frigid air. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, sat beside him, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket, her face mostly hidden by a scarf. The settlement was a handful of log buildings huddled in a valley, a place called Blackwater Creek. It was a town that ran on gossip and suspicion. As they pulled up to the general store, heads turned, windows parted. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Silas had always been an outsider, the strange man from the mountain. But now he was the strange man with the even stranger woman. He helped her down from the cart, his hand briefly on her elbow. A simple gesture, but in the prying eyes of the townsfolk, it was a declaration. Inside the store, the air grew thick and quiet. The storekeeper, a paunchy man named Miller, leaned on the counter, his eyes flicking from Silas to the woman and back again. "Silas," he said, his tone oily. "Been a while. See you found yourself some company." The word company was loaded, ugly. A few men loitering by the pot-bellied stove snickered. Silas ignored him. He handed Miller a list. "Need these things." Miller took the list, his eyes lingering on the woman. She stood tall, her chin up, but Silas could feel the tension rolling off her. She was trying not to shrink under their gaze. "Heard Jebediah lost something valuable," one of the men at the stove said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Something pretty he brought up from the south. Funny she should turn up here." The woman flinched, a barely perceptible movement. Silas, who was counting out coins on the counter, stopped. He didn't look at the man. He just slowly, deliberately turned his head and met the storekeeper's eyes. His gaze was flat, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. It held a promise of violence that was more chilling than any spoken threat. The storekeeper, Miller, swallowed hard. "Jed," he called out to the man at the stove, "shut your damn mouth and mind your business." The man, Jed, grumbled but fell silent. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. It wasn't about numbers or social standing. It was about the raw, primal fact of who, in this room, was the most dangerous, and everyone knew it was the quiet man from the mountain. Silas finished his transaction, his movements unhurried. He gathered the sacks of flour and salt. As he turned to leave, he paused. He looked at the men by the stove, his eyes sweeping over them, cold and dismissive. Then he walked out, the woman following close behind him. No words had been exchanged, no grand defense made, but he had shielded her with his presence, his silence a weapon more potent than any insult. He had drawn a line in the sand around her, and the whole town had seen it. The incident at the store had consequences. It stirred the pot. It made the whispers bolder. Jebediah, nursing his bruised ego and his financial loss, put a bounty on her. Not a legal one, but a whisper in the right ears. $50 to whoever brought his property back to him. $50 was a lot of money in Blackwater Creek. It was enough to make desperate men do stupid things. A few days later, they found out how stupid. Silas was splitting wood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe the only sound in the cold, clear air. The woman was inside, baking bread with their new flour. The smell of it was a small domestic miracle in their harsh world. He'd left her alone. He thought they were safe, that the display in the store was enough. He was wrong. 4 of them came. Not the 2 from before, but a different crew. Local louts, led by the same man from the store, Jed. They came quiet this time, sneaking through the trees. They cornered her when she stepped outside to fetch a bucket of snow to melt for water. Silas heard her cry out. Not a scream, but a sharp, terrified gasp. He dropped the axe. He turned and his blood ran cold. They had her. Jed had her by the arm, his grubby hand tight on her bicep. The other 3 were closing in, grinning like hyenas. "Look what we got here," Jed sneered. "The little lost songbird. $50 says you'll be singing for Jebediah by nightfall." She struggled, her eyes wild with panic. looking desperately toward Silas. And something inside him broke. The vow he'd made to himself when his wife died, the promise to stay out of the world's troubles, to live and die in his isolation, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just moved. He covered the 50 yards between the woodpile and them in a blur of silent, focused rage. They didn't even see him coming until it was too late. He hit Jed first. Not with a fist, but with his whole body, a shoulder driving into the man's chest like a battering ram. The crack of ribs was audible. Jed went down, the air exploding from his lungs. The others turned, surprised. One of them pulled a knife. Silas didn't even slow down. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it until the man screamed and the knife clattered to the snow. A single, brutal punch to the jaw, and the second man was on the ground, spitting blood and teeth. The last two, seeing the cold, efficient violence of this mountain man they'd so badly underestimated, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush like spooked cattle. Silas stood there, breathing heavily, his knuckles bleeding where they'd connected with Jed's teeth. Jed was on the ground, moaning, trying to crawl away. Silas walked over, stood over him, and looked down. "If I ever see you or any of your friends on this mountain again," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I won't stop until you're in the ground. You tell Jebediah that his property is mine now, and I protect what's mine." He turned his back on the groaning man and walked over to her. She was standing frozen, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and something else, awe. He reached out, not to her arm, but to her hand, and gently took it. His touch was firm, grounding. "Let's go inside," he said, his voice soft for the first time. He had crossed a line. He had stepped back into the world, not for himself, but for her. He had claimed her, not as property, but as one of his own. They went back into the cabin, the smell of baking bread filling the air, a stark contrast to the violence outside. The silence that fell between them now was different. It wasn't a silence of caution or unfamiliarity. It was heavy with unspoken emotion, with the aftermath of what he had just done for her. He went to the water basin and began to wash the blood from his knuckles, his back to her. She watched him, watched the strong line of his shoulders, the careful way he tended to his self-inflicted wounds. The fight had been for her. The wounds were for her. She walked over to him, took the rag from his hand, and gently began to clean the cuts herself. He let her. Her touch was feather-light, hesitant at first, then more confident. It was an act of care that mirrored the one he had shown her on her first night. They were tending to each other's wounds, literal and figurative. When she was done, she didn't move away. She just stood there, her head bowed. The air was thick with the need for words, for a confession that went deeper than the story of her escape. "He never called me by my name," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The man who took me from my home, or Jebediah, to them I was girl or thing or something much worse. They took my name from me. It was the first thing they stole." Silas turned to face her. He looked into her eyes, waiting. He knew this was important. He knew this was the heart of it. The fight outside was about her body, but this was about her soul. "When you forget your own name," she continued, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, "you start to forget who you are. You start to believe you are the thing they call you. You become property." She took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. She looked him straight in the eye, a raw, terrifying vulnerability in her gaze. It was the ultimate act of trust, to give him the one thing that was still truly hers. "My mother. She called me Annalise." The name hung in the air between them, beautiful and fragile and strong. Annalise. It was the sound of jasmine and hibiscus in a New Orleans courtyard. It was the sound of a person, not a thing. Silas felt the weight of it, the gift she was giving him. He had fought for her, protected her, and now she was naming herself for him. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently wiping the tear from her cheek. His voice was low, a little rough, as if the word was unfamiliar in his mouth, but he said it with a reverence that made it a prayer. "Annalise," he said, and in the saying of it, everything changed. He wasn't just a reluctant savior anymore, and she wasn't just a victim. He was Silas, and she was Annalise. They were two broken people who had found each other on a cold mountain and had, in a small, quiet room, begun to piece each other back together. The spring thaw came late that year, but it came. The world, which had been locked in white and gray, slowly began to bleed color. Green shoots poked through the melting snow. The creek began to roar with life. The change wasn't just outside, it was inside the cabin, too. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm of a shared life. One morning, after the last of the snow had melted from the small patch of ground near the cabin, Silas went out with a shovel and a hoe. He began to turn the rocky soil, his movements slow and deliberate. It was the patch where the two crosses stood, the land that held his past. He was preparing it for a future. Annalise came out and stood watching him. She didn't ask what he was doing. She knew. This wasn't just gardening. This was an act of faith. After he had broken up the soil, pulling out the largest stones, he went into the cabin and came back with a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it and poured a handful of tiny, dark seeds into his palm. He held them out to her. They were vegetable seeds, heirloom beans and squash, seeds his wife had saved seasons ago, seeds he hadn't had the heart to plant since she'd been gone. He was giving her his past and trusting her with his future. She looked from the seeds in his hand to his face. His expression was steady, unreadable as always, but his eyes held a question. Will you stay? Will you grow here with me? She didn't answer with words. She took the seeds from his palm, their fingers brushing for a moment. Then she knelt down on the damp, cold earth, the earth that held his sorrow, and she began to plant them. One by one, she pushed the tiny seeds into the soil he had prepared. She wasn't just planting a garden. She was putting down roots. In this harsh, unforgiving place, next to the graves of the life he had lost, they were planting the seed of a new one. When she was done, she stood up, her hands covered in dirt. Silas was watching her, a quiet stillness about him. They stood there together, side by side, looking at the small patch of turned earth. It wasn't a promise of a happy ending. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something quieter, and perhaps stronger. It was a seed of belonging, planted in the shared soil of their past wounds, with a silent mutual hope for a future harvest. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and hit that subscribe button for more tales just like this one. We appreciate your support.